Welcome back to episode 2 of the Jungle Fever podcast. I am Ethan Sargent. That is Aiden Crowley over there. Hopefully, to my left, we've got the pinning figured out now so you can see both of our pretty faces on the screen at the same time, because I know that's what you all are out there are really looking for. No Bengals talk. You just want to see the two of us talk about ball. Well, it is draft week, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to draft week. It is one of the funnest weeks of the year, in my opinion, of the football calendar because when we get into the season, you get these high octane games and you get all these awesome things that happen. But when it gets down to draft week, it's no holds barred, and I love it, Aiden. What do you like the most about draft week?
I think for me, it's just the uncertainty of it all. There's so many question marks. You don't know what teams value. You feel like you have a good idea of, man, they're going to lean this way, and then they'll surprise you with a big curveball, or some guy gets taken way higher than you think. Think Michael Penix Jr. with the Atlanta
Yeah.
Falcons. There's just a lot of question marks, and then they all get answered by the end of the draft. And that I just love that. It's a guessing game. And of course, I mean, I'm sure you as well can relate. We all played GM mode on either
Oh,
Madden
yeah.
or 2K, and you want to feel like you're a part of it. So you just sit here with the mock drafts and you're like, okay, I got this figured out. And then you realize on Thursday you have nothing figured
No.
out. I love
Well,
it.
we were lucky enough to be able to go to the draft last year in Detroit. That was an amazing experience. And I'd recommend now that they're doing this where they have the drafts in different cities every year. If the draft is ever close to your city, I know for Bengals fans in Cincinnati, the draft's in Pittsburgh next year. And I know we don't love the city near West Virginia all that much. But if you want to go out to Pittsburgh, I do think Pittsburgh is a relatively nice city. And you can go out there and take in the draft. It really is an awesome fan experience. They do it. The NFL does a really good job. I didn't, besides going to the actual draft, I didn't have to pay a dime to get into the facility itself. You got to get there early because they cap it out. And Detroit, boy, did Detroit show up last year for the NFL draft. 300,000 people were there on day one. And we were part of a group of five of us who were a part of 300,000. And I think I was wearing that same pullover that I wore last week, and I tried to stick my hand up a few times, and you can see that orange just up above the crowd. But it was a great experience, a lot of highs and lows, and well, we'll start with what the Bengals could potentially be looking for this week as the draft is over in Green Bay this year. They're doing it inside Lambeau Field. Could be a little chilly up there, even though it is the last or the second to last week of April. And Aiden, obviously, as we go ahead and look towards the draft, the Bengals do have some holes on their roster. There are some positions which look great, namely the quarterback position when you have this guy there. But you look around this roster and there are significant holes. What do you think are a couple places the Bengals could look to attack? And not just at pick 17 as well. They have 6 selections in this year's draft. Where could they look?
Yeah, I think this draft for the Bengals is one of the drafts where the team need is the most obvious because they just, as we discussed last week, didn't really address some of these needs in free agency. And maybe that told you they liked some of the prospects coming out of the draft. Maybe that's just kind of been the Bengals' MO the last couple of seasons. I'll let you decide that one. But I think for me, interior defensive line, maybe edge, but then again, like we mentioned, you have Trey, you have Joseph Osai, you have Miles Murphy, you have all these guys who they believe in. So maybe not as much, but interior defensive line for me is an obvious glaring need. Even though they did get Slayton, they did bring back BJ Hill. I still think you could use some reinforcements there. Safety for me is a big need. I know Geno Stone stepped it up near the back half of last season. They love Jordan Battle. They want to play him a little bit more. It seemed like as the season went on, as kind of more of a run fit safety. But Geno Stone, I believe, is a free agent next season. So you have to make a decision with him coming up very soon of what kind of production are you going to get from him? Who are you going to replace him with? And then the most obvious and glaring need that I think you will probably want to dive in a little bit more on is guard. Just the fact that they haven't done much with that, and they seem like at this present state with how the roster is constructed, and I know it will change in a week, but it seems like Cody Ford might be the guy they're rolling out at guard. You can't do that if you're Cincinnati, in my opinion. You have to address guard in some capacity over this next week.
And I like Cody Ford. I like Cody Ford. He just cannot be starting at guard on day one, right? And I do think, an issue that the Bengals are going to attack. I really like what you said about the defensive line. I'm going to hit on that first because I actually think the Bengals need a very specific type of interior defensive lineman. They need pass rush juice from that spot. They have plenty of good run defenders, including the man they just signed from Green Bay, TJ Slayton. Like you mentioned, they brought BJ Hill back, like you said. They drafted two defensive tackles last year on day two in Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson. The thing is, both of those guys thrive a bit more in the run game. We saw a lot of flashes from Jenkins towards the back end of last season where he thrived in the run game. But again, neither of those guys are going to give you the sort of pass rush juice that the Bengals need from that interior defensive line position. That's why I love a guy like you talked about last week in Derek Harmon. He is probably the best interior pass rushing specialist in the draft. I think he fits the exact type of defender that the Bengals need in that spot. Obviously, Walter Nolan is very much an option as well. I think he provides a little bit more in the run game. Walter Nolan had over 90 PFF grade against the run last year in college football, which is one of the best in the country. I think he would be a little bit more of a duel because he can rush the passer, but again, that would lean a bit more towards that run game. Then going to that guard position, I would not panic, Bengals fans, if they do not take a guard on day one, right? Because I don't think, well, on the lowest of keys, I don't think they do. And there might be some panic saying, oh, well, guess what? They got 5 more picks, and there is a lot of good offensive line depth in this draft. I'm looking at a guy like Jonah Savanea out of Arizona, a guy the Bengals met with in the pre-draft process. They've met with a lot of good lineman prospects. I put out a list earlier this week of some of the players they met with. They met with a lot of guys I really like, by the way. A lot of players I'm really intrigued about. Omar Norman Lott out of Tennessee is a guy I love in like the 3rd, 4th round range. So looking at some of those things and looking at how the Bengals are going to operate positionally, I think this is the last thing I will say here, is that there's going to be panic on day one. And it genuinely doesn't matter who the Bengals pick. The Bengals could nail it, right? They could draft a guy and you look at the telescope 10 years in the future and or 20 years in the future, he's putting on a gold jacket, right? Bengals fans would still crash out on draft night, right? I think that happened last year with Mims. I think the Bengals have found themselves a pretty dang good football player to Marius Mims. There were some people that were very not happy with this pick, namely the guy pointing to my left right here.
Wait, time out.
No, I'll let you explain it. I'll let you explain it.
Listen, Mims, in my opinion, and the previous, obviously, offensive line coach that we had,
Yes.
I was under the assumption, right, that Mims had to be this freak player that could rise above what the Bengals have been able to produce from an offensive line standpoint in the draft. I mean, you think of guys like Jackson Carman and what they kind of got trapped into with that pick, and they just haven't been able to develop these guys. It just so happened that Mims was too big, too good to fail.
Too dang good.
That's the situation we have.
No,
It
was a fair criticism. It was absolutely a fair criticism. I thought that Mims would be able to rise above that, and thankfully he has. And the Bengals, luckily for them, they don't have to worry about the tackle spot, right? They've got Orlando Brown Jr. out at left tackle, who is very, very good, and then you got Marius Mims, who again I'm only expecting to get better in year 2. Problem is they got to figure out that interior of that line. Ted Karras also in the final year of his contract at center as well. We'll see what they potentially look at in that. I do think that. Again, the Bengals can go a variety of ways at pick 17, but what they do at pick 17 does not necessarily determine what they're going to do on day 2, right? They have 6 picks currently in this year's NFL draft. I mentioned this a little bit last week. I wouldn't rule out a trade down. I do think that the Bengals kind of need more picks, and if they can snag some extra picks later in the draft, they may potentially look into that opportunity. I know some teams around always love to snap back into the draft, and we'll see what the quarterback run is, but maybe if a team like the Giants or maybe even the Browns wants to look to trade up back into the first round, try and sneak into that spot. If I'm the Bengals, I'm listening, honestly. If I'm the Bengals, I'm listening to some offers. And then the other big thing about this is what's going on with Trey Hendrickson. It's been basically, so we talked about it for a while last week, radio silence since then, really. We haven't heard anything either way. And like you said last week, they got to have it sorted by Thursday night, right? If they're so desperate to get a first round pick, you got to get one in this year's draft. So we'll see what happens with that. But I do think the Bengals do have a variety of options at that pick 17 spot.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only issue with trading down is I think a lot of teams in the Bengals position around that 17 to late first round slot, I think a lot of them would like to trade down as well. I think this draft is kind of weird because you have those top end guys who are quite obviously the top end guys. And then from there, it's just kind of a crapshoot of guys who are pretty good and we feel strongly about and they're deep, but there's a lot of guys that you can take in that range. And so I feel like a lot of teams in that position will kind of look to trade down. So it'll be an interesting, I think, draft night and maybe one that doesn't have necessarily the fireworks as some past drafts, but we say that all the time and that tends to end up happening. But to your point about Bengals fans and overreacting, I mean, that's just fans in general. But could you imagine the scenes if like say a Tyler Warren or a Colston Loveland drops to them at 17 and maybe they're in love with Colston Loveland or Tyler Warren and they end up drafting tight end round one. Now I'm not ruling it out. We could talk about it if you want to, but uh,
I'll say
the
my
reaction online would be
if I have like, I guess we could both do this now. It's a fun exercise before we get into some scenarios for the Bengals. I'll fire off a hot take for this draft. I think Colston Loveland goes a lot earlier, excuse me, than a lot of people are expecting. I think a lot of people are really, really, really high on Colston Loveland in circles. And I guess this will be my hot take. I think Colston Loveland gets taken before Tyler Warren. That is my hot take. I think it happens. And it's not, and it really isn't anything against Tyler Warren. I like Tyler Warren as a player. I think he's a very capable tight end. But I think Loveland, you're getting the complete tight end package. Warren is a great player. I just don't know if the blocking is up to a standard that NFL teams are going to like. Loveland can do it all, right? And I'm saying this as an Ohio State fan, and I watch Loveland at Michigan, and he's a very, very good football player. And I really like what Loveland brings. If the Bengals were to take Loveland at 17, you wouldn't hear very many complaints from me.
I don't think either. I'll just piggyback off of this, and I guess this will be my hot take. I don't think either get past the Colts. I think
Mm,
both are
I agree
gone.
with that.
Pick
Yeah,
four, Colts pick 14. I think both.
14 or 15.
Yeah, both are gone by then, in my opinion.
I
I
agree
I
with that.
think they're obviously two good talents, and the Colts themselves have been needing a tight end for I
Very
feel like
much
a
so.
couple years at this point. So yeah, but yeah, if you want
Yeah,
to do, I guess we can kind of pivot into maybe a mock and talk about some scenarios.
Yeah, so we'll start a little bit with that scenario aspect. And there are best and worst cases, right? I think we could just both do like what we think could be a best and worst case really through the first couple rounds because excuse me, once you get into those lower rounds, right? We can mock and throw guys out left and right, and there's absolutely no way we're gonna nail it. If somebody has ever nailed a mock draft, please let me know because I would like your lottery numbers. But when I look at a best case scenario for the Bengals, it starts number one, they need at least one, maybe two more bodies on that line, offensive line. They have to bring in a couple of bodies. I'm looking like a day two and a day three, maybe two day twos. I'm thinking they need to get multiple bodies in the building for those guard spots because you cannot have those two, Volson and Ford, starting week one. It cannot happen. And I know, look, we talked about it last week. Maybe they go out and sign Brandon Sheriff after the draft. Maybe they sign some other free agent guard. But really, besides Sheriff, who is, a bit older, but he's still a proven guard, you're really not going to get a guy that could just plug and play instantly. They did bring in Lucas Patrick, who's a guy who's got a lot of NFL snaps and experience. Didn't allow a sack last year in the snaps that he played. But again, you're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. So they have to get a couple of bodies in the building for that guard room. Number two, I think you mentioned this earlier actually with this first round pick. They have to look at players, not positions. They do this all the time. You know exactly what I'm talking about here. And Bengals fans out there will know the Bengals love to draft positions over players. I look back to 2018. We talked about this last week. The Bengals had a massive, massive, massive need at center. They ended up trading down in the 2018 NFL draft, where they had their guy in Frank Ragnow go one pick before them to the Detroit Lions. By the way, Frank Ragnow, multi-time Pro Bowler. They then take Billy Price with the very next pick, and Billy Price, of course, did not have the Bengals career that many would have envisioned him to have. So the Bengals cannot do that. They cannot shoehorn themselves into, let's say, taking a guard in round one simply because they have such a massive need at guard. If they were to take Tyler Booker in the first round, it would be a massive, massive failure because number one, I don't think Tyler Booker is all that good of a prospect. But number two, that's just a reach based on need. The Bengals cannot do that. If you have a player that you really like, and it does look like they're looking on both the offensive and defensive line for this first round pick. If I'm going to guess, it's going to be one of those two. It's going to be on the line somewhere. I think that first round pick will be on the line somewhere. You have to take the player you like the best. You can't just draft a guard because they have the needed guard. You're going to draft the guard later in the draft. You're probably going to draft multiple. So that'll be my second thing for the best. I guess that kind of goes both ways because I think a best case scenario is, again, they don't do that. They look and they take a guy like a Harmon or a Nolan or a Green. I like all those players. I'd be happy with all those picks in terms of you get a good player on the defensive line that can help your team. I also really like Kelvin Banks Jr. out of Texas. I think that's a guy that you take on the offensive line. He's got a lot of versatility, very strong, powerful player, probably starts for you on day one at guard and can potentially kick out to tackle as well. So a lot to its salt there. But I think, again, when you talk about the worst case scenario, it would be if they were to reach for need. If they were to take Tyler Booker in round one, that's a bad use of first round draft capital. So that's where I guess I'll go in terms of best and worst case scenarios. And what about you? What are you thinking?
You set me up perfectly, actually, because
Beautiful.
right near the end is where I wanted to go. My best case scenario is if a guy like Kelvin Banks Jr. drops to you at 17. I don't see it happening, but I mean, there's a lot of talent at the top end of this draft, like we said, and maybe he kind of gets lost in the shuffle. He's somebody who I think competes and probably wins that starting guard spot day one. And we talked about how important of a position that is. And I agree with you when it comes to the Bengals kind of pigeonholing themselves into guys that they feel like they need to take because of the positional need. And for my worst case scenario, I think if they fall in love with one of these edges that kind of has a lot of question marks. I'm mainly thinking of Shamar Stewart, someone who didn't really show a lot of production in college, but he jumps off the page with a 10 RAS score,
Mhm.
and everybody falls in love with him because he runs fast and jumps far. And maybe some team takes a gamble on him and they feel like they can figure him out, but just the lack of production scares me. And sometimes I know our eyes can get fixated on, man, he ran this at the 40.
Yeah.
This was his broad jump. And it's
Well, the
like,
Bengals did it just 8 years ago, right? John Ross runs a 4.22 40. The Bengals had a massive need at wide receiver. The top two receivers in that draft, in Mike Williams and Corey Davis, were taken before the Bengals draft slot at pick number nine. Pick number nine ends up being John Ross. Pick number 10, the Chiefs traded up to take a guy named Patrick Mahomes. Not that the Bengals would have taken Patrick Mahomes. They didn't really have a needed quarterback at the time. But it stands to serve the proof again that the Bengals have a habit of drafting need over player. And I think that that's a habit they have to break. I think they've been doing a little bit better recently, especially I think last year. I think they did a good job of taking Mims when they probably could have gone elsewhere. But now I think the next step for us to talk about is, well, let's see what they would do. Let's see what we would do if we were the Bengals in this spot. So I'm going to throw up my screen here in just a second. And there we go. Let me know. Is it open? Are we on?
oh,
Beautiful.
yeah, there we
Looks
go.
it looks on to me.
Oh,
So
look at that.
all right. So here we go. We've got the Pro Football Network mock draft simulator up. We've got it on all 7 rounds. We're going to do fast. We're going to enter this draft and we're going to make it happen. So let's see what happens here in the first 16 picks. Um, so we have some very interesting options here. We'll start with the trade up or trade down. So we've got some picks here. Buffalo is offering, I don't believe there's any player trades in this because I would say there might be some Trey Hendrickson offers around here. I don't think they'd be at 17. It would probably be to trade back into the first round would be a Trey Hendrickson trade for the Bengals. So we got Buffalo offering pick 30, pick 56, and a 2026 third rounder to move up 13 places in the draft. I'm not sure. Again, I really don't think I want to trade down just for that. See, this is really interesting, actually. If
I
Cleveland wants
think
to hand us, if Cleveland wants to hand us next year's first, when they're really not going to be all that good, I mean, I think for this service of this exercise, we won't do that.
yeah.
But, and then 22 and 55, yeah, that's not happening. So we're going to reject all these trade offers. I do think I'd actually accept this if I were the Bengals. I think if Cleveland
Our,
throws a first at you for next year,
I think
go right
our
ahead.
good
That could be number one overall. Who
I,
knows?
I think our good friend Grayson Wolf would be having a tirade
Furious.
on Twitter if this
Hmm.
was the situation. But yeah, I think we probably just to keep it simple,
Yeah.
just stick with our picks.
So we got some options and some guys that we've mentioned here, and I think the Bengals would like the board if it falls to them this way. You got Shador Sanders still on the board. I think Shador Sanders right now, with what I'm thinking, I think it's going to be in around the 10 to 20 range for him. I think somebody's going to trade up for him. It could be one of those teams like a Cleveland or a New York that trades back into the first round, or it could be somebody else. Who knows? It could be one of those later first round teams. I'm not sure. Shador is a weird prospect. I
Uh,
have no
I
idea
think
really what
I
to
think
think.
New Orleans makes a lot of sense. Obviously,
Yes.
the recent news from Derek Carr and just kind of the cap hell that they're in right now. I think they make a lot of sense. I think Pittsburgh is in need of a quarterback.
Yeah.
Obviously, Aaron Rodgers still in limbo.
Still.
So I don't know if you feel confident rolling Mason Rudolph out there week one. So yeah, I think Shador is somebody who I don't think falls out of the first round. I think it was from CBS. They had a mock where Shador, or there was only one quarterback taken in the first round, and it was Cam Ward. I just don't see that happening. But yeah, he's definitely an interesting guy. But obviously, the Bengals aren't thinking.
So no, absolutely. And when you look at this board now, the Bengals are loving this board, I think. You've
Yes,
got Colston Loveland out of Michigan, a player I just talked about. You got Derek Harmon, who we've harped on about quite a lot. You got Nick Amon-Wari, who the Bengals did meet with in the draft. That's another guy who he had a great combine, but he also does have a bit more production than Shamar Stewart had in college. You've got Tyler Booker, a guy who I think is just wildly overgraded by a lot of these boards. You've got Jahad Campbell, who is a dynamic linebacker. I talked about him a little bit last week. You've got Josh Simmons, who the Bengals have also met with. You've got Walter Nolan on the board. You got James Pierce is another. I'm looking at guys the Bengals have met with
great
and
board.
trying to meet need and all that. And just because they met, by the way, does not mean the Bengals are going to take them. It just means they have some sort of interest. So, Aiden, looking at this board, what are we thinking? I've got a couple players I like, but what are you thinking?
Yeah, well, just to start, question for you. Are we doing what we would do as GM or what we think the Bengals will do as GM?
I think we'll say what the Bengals will do, and then we'll do what we would do.
Okay. So I think if this were the board that the Bengals had next Thursday, I think they take one of Walter Nolan or Derek Harmon. If I had to guess, I believe that they probably value Nolan a little bit more just based off versatility. I'm a little bit more of a Derek Harmon guy. I know you might want a little bit more run production from Harmon, but his ability to rush the passer is just insane for his size. So I believe they probably lean Walter Nolan. But if I'm sitting in the GM chair, I know that positional value doesn't normally equate for this, but you think about the AFC and you think of guys like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson. You need somebody who can kind of balance the scale a little bit. An athlete who could potentially run these guys down on a third and long when they try to scramble out and extend the pocket and extend the play. I love Campbell out of Alabama. We've talked about him. Obviously, if the medical stuff is clear and he's there at 17, I just think that's where I would lean.
I love Jahad Campbell. I went on like a 2 minute spiel about him last week. He is a really dynamic football player. He's plug and play, right? If you put him right next to Logan Wilson, like I said last week, you're instantly getting a like really, really, really high quality linebacker duo. And Al Golden, linebacker background, was the linebacker coach for the Bengals during the Super Bowl run. Then he goes to Notre Dame, manufactures some really good play there from that defense. So I think that I think they would take, I agree with you. I think they'd take one of the defensive linemen. I think for our purposes, I'm cool with taking John Campbell. I think they really like what they see out of John Campbell. The tape pops. He is a tackle for loss monster. He's always in the backfield. He's got really good play recognition as well. Had an interception against Georgia in that amazing college football game back in week 4 of this past season. And I think that again, a lot of the weaknesses that Jahad Campbell has is perfect for a guy like Al Golden to fix. I think he can work and learn under Al Golden, and I don't think he could fall into a much better situation. So yeah, I'm cool with going Jahad Campbell. I do think they would heavily consider Harmon. They'd even look at Loveland, but I think for our purposes, we'll go with Jahad Campbell here in round one. Now we'll see. Oh, wow. The Seahawks ended up taking Shador there right after it. The Seahawks could potentially be in the quarterback market when you think about it because Sam Darnold has a lot of this contract's very Seahawks friendly. There's opt outs after every year of that deal. So the Seahawks may look into the quarterback market. We'll see how it goes. So I think, again, we'll probably just err on the side of no trades for all this. And now we look at the board in round two here at pick number 49. So we have to remember that we have a linebacker, Jahad Campbell, in round one. And now I like this board too. They've got some real good players on this board, and a lot of guys they've met with as well. They've met with Josh Connerly Jr. out of Oregon. They met with Travion Henderson. They met with Jonas Savaiana. They met with Caleb Johnson out of Iowa. They met with Quinshon Judkins. They could look running back. They could look offensive line. Aiden, where are we thinking?
Yeah, so I love the guy out of Arizona. You nailed the name, so I'm not even going to try.
I don't think I did, but
So I know that he's somebody that the Bengals value. I think he's somebody that could potentially get to round three. I'm curious, just for our purposes, what do the safeties look like right now for the
right
Bengals?
now, we'll go here, defense, safety, and you got Mukaba is a guy the Bengals like. I would not be surprised if this were a pick here. Obviously, Xavier Watts is the guy that keeps getting linked because of the Golden Ties Notre Dame. He goes right here to the Colts at pick 45, so that's off the table in this scenario. I do think if he is there at 49, I would be shocked if the Bengals passed on Xavier Watts. I think the connection would be there with Al Golden, and I think unless they have a guard that they have just completely fallen in love with, I really can't see them passing up on Xavier Watts because of how easy it would be to fit him into Al Golden's system. He's been playing under him now for a couple of years. So I'm interested to see what the Bengals do here. I think, again, I think they'd love this board. I think they'd be very happy with where they were at here. Where do you think they go?
Yeah, so and I'll just throw this out there. If I'm the Bengals, I'm crossing my fingers and hope that Kevin Winston Jr. goes to the third round and we're able to pick him up out of Penn State, the safety. I think he's phenomenal. To be honest with you, I like him a little bit more than Xavier Watts. I know that the Al Golden and Xavier Watts connection carries a lot of weight, but I think Kevin Winston is the third best safety in this class. I think he's phenomenal. But so that's maybe where I would lean at 49, but that might be a little bit more of a reach. So I just think for positional need, and I think Paul Danner's described this draft as a steak and vegetables draft, right? It's not flashy, right? You're not going to wow anybody, but you need to attack what you need. And thankfully, this draft is very deep at those positions of need. So I really like the guard out of Arizona. I think he checks a lot of boxes for you. So that's probably where I would lean.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm going to go as well. I think Savanian is the pick. Just and again, I think they like Henderson. I think Henderson would probably, if they're going to take a running back, I think Henderson would be the pick here in the third round. I think he fits the Bengals mold because he's an elite pass protector and he can give you those splash plays. I think that they might look to Henderson. Wouldn't be surprised if the Bengals took him if he ends up falling to this spot. But I think they got to go with Savanian here. Just with where they're at, I think that they really like what they have here in Savaniana, and I think they go with him.
Yeah, and I'll just say real quick before we
I'll
make
take
that pick,
this.
I'm going to ask: is Tate Ratledge on the board out of Georgia, or was he
Ooh,
already
good
selected?
call.
So if you
Because
just
that's another one that I don't
the
know.
guard,
He is, yeah.
oh,
So they could look there as well.
I like Tate Ratledge more. I just assumed he was off the board. So
I think we'll go with Ratledge because I
yeah,
think that there's been so many connections there. Played with Amarius Mims would
right.
basically slide right into that right guard spot, and you basically recreate that Georgia offensive line. So we'll go with Tate Ratledge because he's a guy the Bengals have been very heavily linked with. And we'll go into round three, where there goes Mukaba. Saw a couple other big names go there. We'll get rid of these trade offers, and we will go here to this. Wow, Jackson Dart sliding all the way to the third round. I already see a guy the Bengals would be all over here. Actually, a couple guys the Bengals would be all over here. I'm looking at TJ Sanders out of South Carolina. I think they'd be all over that pick. I think it would be between him and Omar Norman Lott here. Norman Lott's a really good player as well. The Bengals have met with Omar Norman Lott. They really like what he has. And I think you're probably splitting hairs between these two defensive tackles in terms of where the Bengals would go here in the third round.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I don't have much more to add when it comes to that. Again, all I ask is Kevin Winston Jr. still there? That's all I
Hmm.
ask. But like we said, the defensive line does need
He is
uh,
not. He is
already taken.
not.
So there we go. It's not the Logan Wilson situation where the Bengals
There he
took
goes.
and
The,
then
Ch- the Chiefs. The Chiefs end up getting your boy.
oh, of course. But it's not like the Logan Wilson situation where the Bengals drafted T. Higgins and then just kind of sat there, fingers crossed, and waiting for Logan
Yeah.
Wilson. And he just happened to get there anyway. But I'm right there with you. I think D tackle is great. It just splitting hairs of which guy you like more. So I personally lean towards Sanders, but
So I think if I lean towards Sanders as well, but I think if this is the Bengals board, I think they would take Norman Lott, just because of the meeting, the connections. I think they would go Norman Lott. I by the way, I will say I love Josiah Sword out of Michigan. Really good player that I think is being very undervalued in a lot of these mock drafts. I think he could sneak into the second round. But I'm going to go with, I think we'll go with TJ Sanders. I think the Bengals will be getting a nice steal. This is a second round talent I think you're getting in the
oh,
third round
absolutely.
here. So the Bengals take TJ Sanders out of South Carolina in the third round. We move into day three, where
Got
again,
some
the
North
Bengals do
Carolina
have some
draft here.
needs.
There we go.
So, some interesting points here. The Bengals could look running back. They could look corner. They could look into the secondary now. They haven't attacked the secondary just yet. I think if we look at the safety position right now, Malachi Moore could potentially be an option, even though I think it'd be a little too early for him at this point. You could look at Quincy Riley out of Louisville. And then when you look at just the draft board as a whole, CJ West out of Indiana is a player I do really like. He did a great job. You covered him a little bit over there out in Evansville. He had a great game against Ohio State. Really did a good job against a great offensive line at plugging run gap holes. Thing is, I think the Bengals already might have too much of that profile already. I'm not sure what they look. They could go for Ollie Gordon out of Oklahoma State, running back, just to take some of the load off of Chase Brown. Would they potentially look to bring him in? I'm not sure. Or we could do the old double dip. Jackson Slater out of Sacramento State is a guy the Bengals, I believe, have. I don't know if they met with him. No, I don't think they met with him, but they have looked at him. And then there are two guys down here that the Bengals have also been linked with heavily, in Jack Sawyer out of Ohio State and Danny Stutzman out of Oklahoma. I don't think they'd go Stutzman here because they already took Jahad Campbell in round one. They could very well go Jack Sawyer, a guy that a lot of people have mocked very consistently to the Bengals just because of the Ohio connection and because, well, it would feel like replacing Sam Hubbard with Sam Hubbard.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's exactly where I was going to go. I like Jackson Slater, but I think for this exercise, I don't mind Jack Sawyer here. I think he's somebody that could fill that need, like you mentioned, that basically replacing Sam Hubbard with Sam Hubbard. So we can go there if you want.
Yeah, I'm cool with them taking Sawyer here. You get some good depth on that defensive line, and I think Sawyer. I think in round four, it's a great pick. I don't like round two, not a great pick,
Right.
but I think in round four, I think you're happy with Jack Sawyer. I'm going to take Jack Sawyer there for the Bengals, another guy that they have been very heavily linked with. We move into round five. We'll take a look briefly. I wonder if I can. Yeah, here we can see what they have so far. Jahad Campbell, Tate Ratledge, TJ Sanders, and Jack Sawyer. So they've attacked the defensive line, they've attacked the linebacking position, and they've attacked the offensive line a little bit. I think they're probably looking for maybe one more offensive lineman at this point, and then maybe somebody in the secondary that they could take a flyer on. Really, the way the board has fallen, they haven't really gotten much luck in the secondary. I think they could look at Jake Brenningstool here out of Clemson. I think he's a high upside, low round tight end. They could look for Garrett Dellinger to try and double up. That's a guy who I actually talked about in one of my mock off seasons. A guy with 3 years of starting experience at LSU. I know the Bengals really value high level college experience. We've seen that before. They really, really value having that experience at the top level. I think they go with either Dellinger here or Tommy Hill out of Nebraska just to get some quarterback depth. Where do you go? I'll let you make this one. Who do you think they go with here?
I'm right there with you. And like we mentioned, I don't mind double dipping at guard. I think if there's ever a draft where you double dip at guard, this is the draft. So let's go Dellinger here.
Yeah, I think they will do that. And then, well, this will be the Bengals. If they stay put in all their spots, this will be their last selection. They don't have a seventh round pick this year. And, well, here we go. So, they could triple dip. They could go for Jonah Monheim out of LSU, or excuse me, out of USC. One of my favorite names in the entire draft right here, Tonka Hemingway out of South Carolina. You got Isaiah Bond, who, of course, has some off the field stuff right now, which is having him slide down the draft boards a little bit. You've got Jabbar Muhammad out of Oregon, who I think might be the Bengals pick here. Good, solid cornerback. Played at a couple of high level teams. Played in the national championship for Washington. Then he transfers to Oregon. Plays in the playoff with them. I think the Bengals might look at taking a flyer and a late round pick here in Jabbar Muhammad.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. Secondary is kind of a sneaky need, I think, for this Bengals team. Obviously, you have some guys coming back trying to get a little bit healthier, mainly just Dax Hill that comes to mind for that. But yeah, I'm right there with you. I would love, again, kind of the same talk that we've had before, safety, but it just looks like in this situation the board hasn't really fallen that
Didn't
way.
really, yeah, it didn't really fall their way. They would have had to take, they had the option of Evan Warrior Starks in round one, but in our scenario, we passed on that, and we end up going there for the secondary. I think again, as we'll look at this draft briefly, and we'll talk about some pluses and minuses of it before we wrap things up. I think the one thing I do really like is they do attack that defense big time, and I think they get much better right now on defense. I don't think a lot of these guys are projects. I think you're getting some sure bets on the defense side of the ball. I think my biggest issue with this draft, I think, is you're banking a lot on some of your secondary to bounce back. You're banking on Cam Taylor-Britt to look like 2022. You're banking on DJ Turner to bounce back from, he's starting to play some of his best football, bounce back from his clavicle injury. You're betting on Dax Hill, coming back and looking good after his ACL tear. So I think that there is a lot of good. I really do like this draft, but there's also definitely an element of some risk in this draft as well.
Yeah, in my opinion, you kind of hit the nail on the head. I think this draft that we have is sort of high floor, low ceiling, in my opinion. Which in this situation and with how the roster is constructed, specifically on the offensive side of the ball, I'm fine with that. I think we just need to shore up the defensive side, obviously making some much needed improvements there, but the offense doesn't really need to be touched that much. I think they're at the level that they need to be. I think they're a Super Bowl caliber offense. It's just getting the rest of the team at that point. So
yeah, it's why they didn't take any offensive skill position players in this draft, and obviously that might be the flashy pick, and they may well go running back. I don't think they take a receiver in this draft. They're pretty good there, but I don't think it would surprise me if they took a running back, and especially in that second or third round, if they really like what they see out of Travion Henderson or, Quidshot Judkins, Caleb Johnson, all guys with connections to Ohio, whether it was Caleb in high school or Quidshot and Travion in college, there is potential there for the Bengals to potentially take a running back. So we'll stop the screen share. We'll come back onto your screens now, and we'll say that that'll do it for this edition of the Jungle Fever podcast. Next week, of course, we're going to be breaking down every single pick the Bengals make. We'll be live tweeting you as well. I'll be on my phone all day Thursday, all day Friday. I'll even be looking on Saturday. So make sure that you guys are following us on our social media platforms. We've got our Twitter now going, and we're going to be live on Spotify and YouTube. So if you're watching us, we appreciate it. And if you're listening to us, we also greatly appreciate it as well. Going to be a real fun one next week. We'll see how the Bengals improve their team in 2025 to try and get back to the Super Bowl. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. This has been the Jungle Fever Podcast.